Have you ever wondered just how far loyalty can go? Imagine someone being there for you no matter what happens, someone who would risk everything just to keep you safe. Today's story is about that kind of loyalty. It's about a brave police officer, Mark Jensen, and his amazing canine partner, Shadow. This story will leave you speechless. It might even make you a little teary-eyed because it shows how strong the bond between a human and a dog can be. But before we jump into this incredible story, here's a question for you: how far would you go to save someone you love? Would you face danger head-on? Would you risk your own safety? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And trust me, you'll want to stay until the end of this story. Something truly amazing happens, something you'll never forget. Officer Mark Jensen was just like any other officer in his town. He worked hard every day, always making sure the people in his community were safe. But Mark wasn't alone in his job. His partner, Shadow, was by his side every step of the way. Shadow wasn't just any partner, he was a canine dog, trained to help Mark in the toughest situations. Mark and Shadow had worked together for years. They were more than just a team. They were best friends. Shadow was a big, strong German shepherd with sharp eyes and quick reflexes. Everyone at the police station admired him. He was known for his bravery and cleverness, but to Mark, Shadow was more than just a great police dog. He was family. Every morning, when Mark got ready for work, Shadow would wag his tail excitedly, ready to go. The bond between them was unbreakable. One sunny morning, Mark and Shadow headed out for what seemed like a normal day. The two of them had been called to check on a strange situation at an old warehouse. It didn't seem too serious at first. Just a break-in, they thought. But as they arrived, something felt off. The warehouse looked dark and empty, but Shadow, always alert, started growling softly. His ears perked up, and his body tensed. Mark knew right away that Shadow had sensed danger. "Stay close, buddy," Mark whispered, patting Shadow on the head. The two entered the warehouse carefully. The air inside was cold and heavy, and every little sound echoed through the large, empty space. Shadow sniffed the ground, his nose twitching as he searched for clues. Suddenly, there was a loud clatter, a metal pipe falling to the ground. Mark turned quickly, his heart racing. Before he could react, men appeared from the shadows. "Looks like we've got company," one of them sneered, holding a crowbar in his hand. Mark tried to stay calm, but it was clear he was outnumbered. There were at least 4 of them, all armed and looking dangerous. Shadow barked loudly, his deep, fierce growls filling the warehouse. He stood protectively in front of Mark, ready to defend him no matter what. One of the men laughed. "What's a dog going to do? You think he can stop us?" But Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was a trained canine, and he knew exactly what to do in moments like this. Mark tried to talk the men down, but they weren't interested in listening. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Let's settle this without anyone getting hurt." But the men didn't back off. They were determined to cause trouble, and before Mark could act, one of them swung their weapon, knocking him to the ground. The world spun as Mark hit the cold concrete floor. Shadow barked wildly, lunging at the attackers, but one of them grabbed the brave dog and held him back. Mark's vision blurred as he tried to get up, but the blow had left him dizzy and weak. Everything around him felt like it was moving in slow motion. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Shadow struggling to break free, his sharp teeth snapping in defiance. Hours seemed to pass, though Mark wasn't sure how long he had been out. When he finally woke up, his head throbbed, and his hands were tied tightly behind his back. He was in a small, dark room with no windows. The air smelled damp, and the sound of water dripping echoed through the space. He tried to move, but the ropes were too tight. "Where's Shadow?" he thought, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't hear his partner, and the silence was deafening. He felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Had they hurt Shadow? Was he okay? Mark closed his eyes, trying to stay calm. Shadow's strong, he told himself. He'll find a way. Just as he began to lose hope, he heard something faint. It was a sound he knew all too well, a scratching noise, like paws against wood. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Shadow, he whispered. The scratching grew louder, and then came a soft whimper, followed by a low growl. Mark's heart raced with hope. Shadow was alive, and he was close. Suddenly, the door burst open with a loud crash. Shadow had broken free. The brave dog stood in the doorway, his eyes blazing with determination. Without hesitation, he charged at one of the men guarding the room, knocking him off balance. Mark watched in awe as Shadow used his training to take control of the situation. The dog's speed and strength were incredible. Using the distraction Shadow had created, Mark managed to free his hands from the ropes. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he joined the fight. Together, he and Shadow worked as a team, just like they always had. Mark couldn't believe the courage and loyalty his partner showed. Shadow wasn't just fighting for him, he was fighting with him. The commotion attracted attention, and soon, backup arrived. Other officers rushed in, arresting the attackers and securing the area. Mark and Shadow stood side by side, exhausted but victorious. The danger was over, and they had made it through together. Back at the station, Mark sat quietly, looking at Shadow. The dog was tired but seemed proud, his tail wagging slowly. Mark leaned down and hugged him tightly. "You saved my life, buddy," he said softly. Shadow licked Mark's face, as if to say, "I'll always have your back." This story shows just how powerful loyalty can be. Shadow didn't just protect Mark, he risked his own life to make sure his partner was safe. That's the kind of bond that can't be broken. How far would you go to save someone you love? Would you face danger like Shadow did? Let me know in the comments below. And always remember, sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes, they have paws. Officer Mark Jensen was just an ordinary man to those who passed him on the street. To them, he was just another face in a crowd, wearing a uniform and doing his job. But to the people who worked with him at the police station, Mark was much more than that. He was the officer everyone trusted when things got tough. Whether it was handling a dangerous situation or helping someone in need, Mark was always the first to step up. He was strong, smart, and dependable. But to Shadow, his canine partner, Mark wasn't just another police officer. To Shadow, Mark was his whole world. Shadow was a big, brave German shepherd with shiny black and tan fur and bright, intelligent eyes. He wasn't just a dog, he was Mark's partner, best friend, and protector. Wherever Mark went, Shadow was right by his side. Together, they had faced all kinds of challenges, from chasing down criminals to helping lost children find their way home. Shadow loved Mark more than anything. Every morning, when Mark got ready for work, Shadow would wag his tail so hard it looked like it might fall off. He would bark softly, as if to say, "I'm ready. Let's go." And Mark would always smile and pat Shadow on the head, saying, "Let's do this, buddy." That morning started out just like any other. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and Mark and Shadow were on patrol in their police car. The streets were quiet, and everything seemed peaceful. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked up and his nose twitching as he watched the world go by. He was always alert, always ready. To Shadow, every sound and every movement was important. He was trained to notice things that other people might miss. As they drove through town, Mark's radio crackled to life. "Unit 7, we've got a report of a break-in at the old warehouse on Oak Street. Please investigate." Mark picked up the radio and replied, "Unit 7, on our way." He glanced at Shadow, who was already sitting up straighter, his tail wagging slightly. "Looks like we've got some work to do, buddy," Mark said. Shadow let out a small bark, as if to say, "I'm ready." Mark turned the car onto Oak Street and parked a short distance from the warehouse. The building was old and run down, with broken windows and rusty doors. It had been abandoned for years, and most people stayed away from it. But now, someone had broken in, and it was Mark's job to find out who and why. Mark stepped out of the car, and Shadow jumped out right behind him. Shadow's nose went to the ground immediately, sniffing for any clues. Mark patted him on the head and said, "Stay close, Shadow. Let's check this out." The two of them approached the warehouse carefully. Mark pushed open the heavy metal door, and it creaked loudly as it swung open. The inside of the warehouse was dark and dusty, with broken furniture and old boxes scattered everywhere. The air smelled damp and musty, and every step they took echoed in the empty space. Shadow was on high alert. His ears twitched, and his nose kept sniffing the air. Mark could tell that Shadow was sensing something, but he didn't know what. "What is it, boy?" Mark whispered. Shadow let out a low growl, his eyes focused on the shadows ahead. Mark's heart started to beat a little faster. He had been a police officer for years, and he knew how to handle dangerous situations, but something about this felt different. He could feel the tension in the air. He gripped his flashlight tighter and said softly, "Let's keep moving." They walked further into the warehouse, their footsteps crunching on the dusty floor. Suddenly, there was a loud noise, a metal pipe clattering to the ground. Mark froze, his flashlight sweeping across the room. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm and steady. For a moment, there was silence. Then, out of the shadows, a group of men appeared. There were 4 of them, and they didn't look friendly. One of them held a crowbar, and another had a heavy chain in his hands. They sneered at Mark, their eyes cold and menacing. Well, what do we have here?" one of the men said, his voice dripping with mockery. "A cop and his dog. This should be fun." Mark's grip on his flashlight tightened. He could feel Shadow tensing up beside him, ready to protect his partner. "This doesn't have to get ugly," Mark said calmly. "Let's all take a step back and talk this through." But the men didn't back down. One of them laughed and said, "Oh, we're not going anywhere, officer. You walked right into our trap." Before Mark could react, one of the men lunged at him. Mark tried to defend himself, but he was outnumbered. Shadow barked loudly, his growls echoing through the warehouse as he leaped into action. He lunged at one of the attackers, his teeth bared and his body moving with incredible speed. But the men were prepared. One of them grabbed Shadow and held him back, while another hit Mark with the crowbar, knocking him to the ground. Mark's head spun as he fell, and the last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Shadow struggling to break free, his fierce growls filling the air. Mark didn't know how long he was out. When he finally woke up, his head was pounding, and his hands were tied behind his back. He was lying on the cold, hard floor of a small room. The air was damp and smelled of mildew. He tried to move, but the ropes around his wrists were tight. "Where's Shadow?" Mark thought, his heart racing. He couldn't hear his partner, and the silence was terrifying. They wouldn't hurt him, he told himself. Shadow's too strong. He'll find a way. Mark closed his eyes, trying to stay calm, but worry filled his mind. He had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. This time, he wasn't just worried about himself. He was worried about Shadow, his loyal partner and best friend. Little did Mark know, Shadow was already on the move. The brave dog had managed to break free from the man holding him. He was determined to find Mark and save him, no matter what it took. Shadow's loyalty and courage would soon be put to the ultimate test. The call came in during Mark and Shadow's routine patrol, suspicious activity at the old warehouse on the edge of town. Possible break-in. Please investigate. Mark glanced at the dashboard clock. It was almost the end of his shift, and he was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. Probably just another false alarm, he muttered to himself. But he knew better than to assume anything in his line of work. Mark turned to Shadow, who was sitting in the passenger seat, his ears perked up. Shadow's nose twitched as if he already sensed something. The drive to the warehouse wasn't long, but the further they went from the busy streets, the quieter it got. The warehouse sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty lots and tall, overgrown grass. The building was old and forgotten, its walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. Mark had passed by it many times, but now it seemed different, ominous, almost. Mark parked the patrol car a short distance away and killed the engine. The silence was heavy, the kind that made your skin crawl. He stepped out, and Shadow jumped down right behind him. The dog's sharp ears twitched, and his tail stood stiff. A low growl rumbled in Shadow's throat. Mark froze for a moment. He had learned to trust Shadow's instincts. Shadow was trained to notice danger long before any human could, and right now, his partner was on high alert. "Easy, boy," Mark whispered, patting Shadow's head. "Stay close." As they approached the warehouse, Mark's eyes scanned the area. The building loomed large in front of them, its broken windows like dark, empty eyes. The metal door creaked loudly as Mark pushed it open. The sound echoed through the building, breaking the eerie stillness inside. The warehouse was huge, with high ceilings and rows of dusty, empty shelves. Old boxes and scraps of metal were scattered on the floor. The air was damp and smelled like rust and mildew. Mark's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the dust swirling in the air. Shadow moved silently by his side, his nose low to the ground, sniffing for any signs of trouble. Mark's heart began to beat a little faster. The place was too quiet, unnaturally quiet. His instincts told him something wasn't right, and the tension in the air felt like it could snap at any moment. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, scanning the room carefully. Suddenly, there was a loud clatter. The sharp sound of metal hitting the floor echoed through the warehouse. Mark whipped around, his flashlight searching for the source of the noise. Shadow growled louder now, his body tensing as he stared into the shadows ahead. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice firm but calm. The words hung in the air, unanswered. Mark's eyes darted around the room, but he couldn't see anyone. The silence returned, but now it felt heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. Mark's pulse quickened. Every muscle in his body was on edge, ready to react. Then, out of nowhere, figures emerged from the darkness. At least 4 men stepped out from behind the shelves, their faces hard and their movements deliberate. They were armed, one with a crowbar, another with a chain, and the rest holding makeshift weapons like metal pipes. Mark's flashlight caught their faces, and he could see the cold, sneering expressions on each of them. One man, taller than the rest, stepped forward. His lips curled into a cruel smile. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like the cops sent us a little party. And he brought his dog too. How thoughtful." Mark stood his ground, keeping Shadow close to his side. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice steady. "Let's all stay calm and talk this through. Nobody needs to get hurt." But the men didn't back down. They spread out, slowly surrounding Mark and Shadow. The tall man chuckled darkly. "Oh, we don't plan on getting hurt, officer. But you? You walked right into a trap." Mark's grip on the flashlight tightened. His mind raced, trying to assess the situation. He was outnumbered, and these men looked like they meant business. But Mark wasn't about to let fear take over. He had faced danger before, and he wasn't alone. He had Shadow. Shadow barked sharply, the sound echoing through the warehouse like a warning. His growls grew louder, his body low and ready to spring into action. One of the men took a step closer, and Shadow barked again, louder this time. The man hesitated, clearly intimidated by the fierce canine. "Call off your dog," the tall man sneered. "Or things are gonna get messy." Mark didn't move. "Shadow's only here to protect me," he said firmly. "But if you make the wrong move, he won't hold back." The tension in the room was thick. For a moment, it seemed like the men might back off. But then one of them lunged forward, swinging his weapon at Mark. Everything happened in a blur. Mark ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and Shadow leapt into action. The dog lunged at the attacker, his teeth bared and his growls fierce. The man yelled in surprise, stumbling backward as Shadow's powerful jaws clamped onto his arm. The other men reacted quickly. One of them grabbed a metal pipe and swung it at Shadow, forcing the dog to let go and retreat. Another man rushed at Mark, striking him hard with the crowbar. Mark felt the impact hit his shoulder, and he stumbled, dropping his flashlight. "Shadow!" Mark shouted, but before he could do anything, one of the men grabbed the dog and held him back. Shadow snarled and struggled, his sharp teeth snapping at the attacker. But the man held tight, keeping the brave canine restrained. Mark tried to fight back, but the odds were against him. Another blow landed on his side, and he fell to the ground, his vision blurring. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Shadow, still struggling against the man holding him, his fierce growls echoing in the distance. Shadow lunged without hesitation, his powerful body moving like lightning. His growl was deep and fierce, echoing through the dark, dusty warehouse. He leaped at the closest attacker, his sharp teeth snapping inches away from the man's arm. The attacker shouted in surprise, stumbling backward. For a moment, Shadow had the upper hand, but the other men quickly closed in. Mark swung his flashlight, using it to defend himself against another attacker. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice firm. But there were too many of them. One of the men swung a metal pipe, and Mark barely dodged in time. Shadow, sensing Mark's danger, turned his attention to the man with the pipe, lunging at him with all his strength. It was chaos. The sounds of shouting, barking, and metal clanging filled the air. Shadow fought bravely, his jaws snapping at anyone who got too close to Mark. But there were too many attackers, and they were armed. One of them grabbed Shadow from behind, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck and pulling him back. Shadow growled and twisted, trying to break free, but the man held on tightly. Mark turned to help Shadow, but before he could, a sharp blow struck him on the side of the head. The pain was blinding. His vision blurred, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. "Shadow," he called out weakly, his voice fading as darkness closed in around him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Shadow, still struggling against the attacker holding him. When Mark woke up, his head throbbed like it had been hit with a hammer. He groaned softly, his eyes fluttering open. The room around him was dimly lit and damp. The air smelled like mold, and water dripped somewhere in the distance. He tried to move, but his hands were tied tightly behind his back, and his ankles were bound as well. Mark blinked, trying to piece together what had happened. His memories came rushing back: the warehouse, the attackers, Shadow's fierce growls. "Shadow," he whispered. His heart sank as he realized his partner wasn't there. He looked around the room. The walls were made of cracked concrete, and there was nothing in the room except for a single chair and an old, rusty door. Panic started to creep in. What do they want, he wondered. Why am I here? But more than anything, he worried about Shadow. Was his loyal canine okay? Had they hurt him? Mark closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He needed to think clearly. He tugged at the ropes around his wrists, but they were too tight. He felt helpless, but he refused to give up. He knew Shadow wouldn't give up on him, either. As Mark sat there in the silence, he suddenly heard a faint sound. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper. Scratch! 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 He froze, holding his breath. Was he imagining it? The sound came again, this time louder. Scratch! Scratch! Mark's heart began to race. Shadow, he called out softly, his voice hopeful but unsure. The scratching grew louder, and Mark could now hear a faint whimper, followed by a low growl. He knew that sound anywhere. It was Shadow. Mark's chest filled with a mix of relief and determination. Shadow had found him. His brave partner hadn't given up. The attackers had underestimated Shadow's loyalty and intelligence. They didn't know what the dog was capable of. The scratching stopped for a moment, and then there was a soft thud, as if Shadow had thrown himself against the door. He's trying to get in, Mark thought. He's not going to leave me here. Mark's mind raced. Shadow was trained for situations like this. He had been through countless hours of training to handle emergencies. But Mark also knew that Shadow wasn't just following his training, he was driven by the unbreakable bond they shared. Outside the room, Shadow was working tirelessly. The attackers had left him tied up, but they didn't realize just how strong and clever he was. Shadow had managed to chew through the ropes, using his sharp teeth to break free. Once he was loose, he followed Mark's scent, his powerful nose leading him straight to the room where his partner was being held. Shadow's instincts were sharp, but his heart was sharper. He wasn't just a K9, he was Mark's protector and best friend. He had already escaped one of the attackers, dodging their attempts to catch him again. Now, he was focused on one thing, getting to Mark. Inside the room, Mark struggled against his ropes again. He twisted his wrists, trying to loosen the knots. The sound of Shadow at the door gave him hope. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "I know you can do it." Then, Mark heard a loud bang. Shadow had thrown himself against the door with all his weight. The door rattled but didn't budge. Another bang followed, and then another. Shadow wasn't giving up. He barked loudly, the sound filled with determination. The noise must have alerted the attackers, because Mark heard footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and one of the men stepped in, holding a crowbar. "What's all the noise?" the man grumbled, glaring at Mark. Before the man could take another step, Shadow burst through the partially open door. The force of his leap knocked the man to the ground. Shadow growled fiercely, standing over the attacker. The man tried to get up, but Shadow snapped his jaws, warning him to stay down. "Good boy, Shadow," Mark said, relief flooding his voice. Shadow turned to Mark, his eyes filled with determination. He quickly moved to Mark's side, using his teeth to tug at the ropes around Mark's wrists. Mark felt the ropes loosen, and within moments, his hands were free. "Let's get out of here," Mark said, rubbing his wrists and standing up. He untied his ankles and grabbed the crowbar the attacker had dropped. Shadow stayed close to him, ready to protect him from any danger. The pair moved cautiously through the building, with Shadow leading the way. The attackers were nowhere to be seen. They must have run off after hearing Shadow's fierce barks. Mark felt a surge of pride as he followed his loyal partner. By the time they made it outside, the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds. Mark knelt down and hugged Shadow tightly. "You did it, buddy," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved me." Shadow wagged his tail and licked Mark's face, as if to say, "I'll always be here for you." The bond between Mark and Shadow was stronger than ever. The attackers had underestimated them, but they had proven that together, they could face anything. Shadow wasn't just a K9, he was a hero. The room was silent except for the faint sounds of water dripping from the ceiling. Mark sat in the dim light, tied to a chair, his wrists raw from trying to free himself. His head throbbed, but his mind was focused on one thing, Shadow. He had to believe his loyal partner was out there, trying to find him. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash shattered the silence. The door burst open with a force that sent it slamming against the wall. In the doorway stood Shadow, his powerful body silhouetted against the light spilling in from the hallway. His eyes burned with determination, and his ears were pinned back. He looked like a superhero ready to save the day. Shadow didn't hesitate for even a second. His sharp bark echoed through the room as he launched himself at the nearest attacker. The man barely had time to react before Shadow's teeth clamped onto his arm, making him drop the crowbar he was holding. Chaos erupted. The other attackers scrambled, shouting in confusion and fear. They hadn't expected a dog to break in, let alone one as fierce and well-trained as Shadow. One of the men lunged at Shadow, but the dog was too quick. He dodged the attack and growled menacingly, his teeth bared. Mark's heart pounded as he watched Shadow in action. Despite the pain in his head and the tight ropes around his wrists, a surge of hope flooded his chest. "That's my boy," he thought, his voice barely a whisper. Shadow's training kicked in like second nature. He knew exactly what to do. With precision and focus, he went after the second man, who had been fumbling to pick up the crowbar dropped by his partner. Shadow leaped, knocking the man off balance. The crowbar clattered to the ground again, and the man stumbled backward, hitting the wall with a grunt. Meanwhile, Mark wriggled his wrists, trying to loosen the ropes that bound him. The chaos in the room gave him the distraction he needed. Shadow was keeping the attackers so busy that none of them noticed Mark's quiet struggle.